April 17th, 1944, south of Carentan, Normandy, France. A thick morning fog clung low to the bocage countryside, softening the thunder of artillery that still rumbled in the distance. The hedgerows were slick with dew, and the air was pungent with churned earth and cordite. Feldwebel Otto Weiss, a 27-year-old squad leader in the 91st Luftland Infantry Division, pressed his back to the muddy wall of a sunken road. His MP-40 was slick with condensation, hands raw from days without gloves, fingers trembling not just from cold, but from exhaustion. Otto had fought through the chaos of the Allied push after the airborne landings. His platoon had already dwindled to a dozen men, and ammunition was down to what they could scavenge from fallen comrades. The American paratroopers were relentless, phantoms who seemed to melt through the hedgerows, appearing where they weren't expected, and overwhelming positions in minutes. When the grenade landed near his feet, Otto didn't even have time to shout. A blast. A white-hot scream of pain. Then darkness. Otto awoke in fragments. Blinding white light. The hum of motors. The scent of alcohol and iodine. A gentle hand pulling back his eyelids, and a language he didn't understand, but didn't need to. English. American. He was in a tent. No, a hospital. A field hospital. The pain in his left leg was unbearable. He tried to move, but was gently restrained by a young medic, a corporal with freckles, and eyes that betrayed neither cruelty nor kindness, just duty. "You're going to be all right," the American said simply, checking the bandage on Otto's thigh. The words meant little, but the tone was calm, professional. Otto turned his head and saw the others, dozens of them, German and American wounded alike, lined up in olive-drab cots under canvas sheets. Nurses moved quickly between them. The clink of metal trays, murmurs of triage decisions, and a shout from a surgeon just outside the tent cut through the haze. "Penicillin! Get the penicillin ready!" Otto's brow furrowed. Surely he had misheard. That word, penicillin. It wasn't supposed to be here, not in a field hospital, not on him. That miracle was for the elite, the officers, the SS, the men who mattered in the Reich. He slipped in and out of consciousness for the next day. Fever gripped him, and his wound had begun to fester. But every time he awoke, someone was there. A medic cleaning the gash, an American nurse changing the IV line, a surgeon examining his vitals. He wasn't interrogated. He wasn't left to rot. And most shocking of all, he wasn't denied treatment. On the second day, as he regained enough strength to sit up, Otto saw it for himself. A glass vial, small, amber-colored, pulled from a crate and attached to a syringe. The label, Penicillin, U.S. Army Medical Corps. The nurse, an older woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, spoke gently but firmly as she administered it into the IV line. Otto stared at the vial in disbelief. "For mich?" he asked, voice cracking. "For you," she said. Word spread quickly among the captured Germans. By the third day, Otto was no longer alone in his astonishment. A young radio operator from the 352nd Infantry whispered hoarsely from the cot beside him, "They have so much of it. They're using it on everyone." Another nodded, his arm in a sling. "At home, we heard Goebbels say it was a myth. Only the Führer's surgeon had it." Otto looked around at the antiseptic efficiency, the discipline, the calm under pressure. The Americans were moving through dozens of patients an hour, triaging with practiced skill. Medics in khaki with red crosses on their helmets didn't yell or panic. They moved with cold certainty. For a man who had been told the Allies were chaotic, weak, and lacking in will, this sight, this care, was more terrifying than any weapon. Late that night, Otto couldn't sleep. The pain had subsided somewhat. His thoughts did not. He looked at the sky through a tear in the canvas roof and saw stars. Somewhere out there, more men were dying, more friends being dragged from hedgerows into the same canvas-walled sanctuaries, filled with life-saving medicine the Germans didn't have. He had believed in the superiority of the Reich, in its science, its strength. But now, he wondered what else had been a lie. As a medic passed by, Otto stopped him. "Warum?" he asked softly. "Why do you give us this Dassen?" The medic didn't answer for a moment. He looked at Otto, then shrugged. "You're human, aren't you?" May 1944, Hamburg Military Hospital, Germany. Dr. Kurt Mahler, chief surgeon at the Kriegsmarine Central Medical Facility, moved briskly through the tiled corridors. The air was clean, too clean, more chemicals than life, and the antiseptic scent couldn't quite mask the undertone of desperation. He reached a locked cabinet in Ward C, removed a ring of keys from his belt, and opened the heavy metal door. Inside, 4 vials. That was all that remained. 4 precious glass ampoules, each stamped with faded Gothic script and the eagle insignia of the Wehrmacht. He counted them again, even though he already knew the number. Then he relocked the cabinet. These vials held penicillin, produced only in trace amounts by German laboratories in 1944, after years of failed replication attempts. The Americans, it was rumored, had flooded their supply chains with the drug, using deep fermentation methods perfected by scientists in Peoria, Illinois. In Germany, however, it was still experimental, costly, difficult, elusive. Only high-ranking officers had any hope of receiving it. Mahler sighed and signed the inventory ledger. The next case would arrive within the hour, a colonel in the Luftwaffe with septic shock from an abdominal wound. Mahler had already rejected 3 lower-ranking patients this week, ordinary infantrymen with gangrenous wounds, doomed not by their injuries, but by their status. He hated it, but orders were orders, and the drug, as precious as gold, could not be wasted. Meanwhile, in Normandy, back in the U.S. 2nd Armored Division's mobile hospital zone, Corporal James "Jimmy" Halperin opened the latest crate from the rear logistics line. It had arrived barely an hour ago, dropped by a C-47 transport that bounced supplies between England and the rapidly expanding American front. Inside were medical dressings, sulfa packets, and 24 units of penicillin in sterile vials. He whistled low. "Hey, Doc, we're flush again." Captain Eleanor Myers, chief medical officer of the field unit, walked over and peered into the crate. "That's more than we had all of last month," she muttered. "Good. We'll need it." Their casualty rates had skyrocketed in recent weeks. Mines, mortar shrapnel, infections, and yet something remarkable had emerged. A sharp drop in fatalities from infected wounds. Penicillin wasn't just helping. It was changing the rules of war. And that included the prisoners. "We got 4 more POWs incoming from the hedgerow fighting near St. Lo," Jimmy said, nodding toward a pair of medics unloading stretchers from an ambulance jeep. Eleanor turned to him. "Triage them. Same as ours." "You got it, Cap." Feldwebel Otto Weiss was now stable. The infection in his thigh was receding. The swelling had gone down, and for the first time in a week, he could place his foot on the dirt and bear a sliver of weight. But it wasn't just his body that was healing. It was his view. He watched an American orderly wipe sweat from his brow, helping a wounded SS officer onto a cot. despite the black uniform, despite the insignia. He overheard a medic talking casually about baseball scores back home, while stitching up a soldier who had moments earlier tried to kill him on the field. It was surreal. A fellow POW, Obergefreiter Heinz Müller, leaned toward Otto and whispered bitterly, "We would have left them to die. You know that." Otto didn't answer. He knew Heinz was right, and that made it worse. June 5th, 1944, near Cherbourg. A U.S. military photographer captured a rare image, a German prisoner, bandaged and conscious, sharing a cigarette with a U.S. medic outside a field tent. The caption would read, "Enemy treated, humanity in uniform." That photo would be published in Stars and Stripes a month later. But what it didn't show, what no photo could, was the quiet astonishment rippling through German ranks, prisoner by prisoner. Each one brought into American medical care expecting brutality or neglect. Each one treated with a level of professionalism and access to medicine they'd been told was impossible. For them, the war was still lost. But something deeper had cracked. In his recovery tent, Otto wrote in a small, sweat-stained notebook he'd kept hidden in his boot. Since Normandy, the Americans treat even their enemies with more medical respect than we give our wounded comrades. They use penicillin like it is salt. I wonder, if this is what defeat looks like, then perhaps what we believed was never strength at all. June 1944. Pine Camp Army Hospital, New York. Thousands of miles away from the hedgerows of Normandy, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Whitcomb stood at a long steel workbench in the medical logistics lab at Pine Camp. Crates stamped with medical supply, Priority A, were being sealed and stacked by the hour, bound for depots in Britain and the fast-expanding network of forward operating bases in France. Whitcomb adjusted his glasses and read the requisition manifest. 5,000 units of penicillin, distributed across 3 airdropped hospitals. Over the past 6 months, the flow had grown from a trickle to a flood. Thanks to breakthroughs by civilian researchers at Pfizer and the USDA, the U.S. had scaled penicillin production through deep tank fermentation, creating a surplus so vast that it wasn't just a luxury, it was strategy. "This isn't just saving lives," Whitcomb had told a War Department liaison weeks earlier. "It's winning hearts. Even our enemies are starting to talk." That wasn't exaggeration. Field reports from France had started noting the psychological impact penicillin was having, not on Allied troops, but on German POWs. These men, raised on propaganda that painted Americans as weak, decadent, and disorganized, were arriving at field hospitals expecting decay and cruelty, and finding modern medicine and compassionate care. And when they saw penicillin, the so-called miracle drug they believed only Hitler's personal physician had access to, flowing freely, they started to wonder if they'd been lied to all along. July 1944, U.S. Field Hospital, 103, St. Louis Sector. Corporal Halperin watched a young medic from Boston gently insert an IV line into the arm of a trembling Wehrmacht conscript. The man's uniform was stained with blood and dried mud, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. He was maybe 17, maybe younger. "I got this one," Halperin said, kneeling beside the cot. "Hey, buddy. Easy. It's all right." The German flinched at first, eyes wide, expecting the needle to bring pain. Instead, it brought penicillin. Pure, effective, flowing into his bloodstream. Another American nurse walked by with a clipboard. "That's 3 German cases we've stabilized today, thanks to the P. 4 if you count the sniper with the femoral tear, Halperin said. They're going to talk, you know. What do you mean? I mean when the war's over, if they go home, they're going to tell people what they saw here. Halperin looked around the tent, the dull glow of surgical lights flickering against canvas walls, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors powered by portable batteries, the scent of antiseptic and boiled coffee. He nodded. Yeah, I hope they do. Back in the Reich, a different reality. A letter intercepted by Allied intelligence in early August, written by a German officer to his wife and smuggled out through neutral Sweden, revealed the quiet panic. I have spoken to prisoners who claim the Americans administer penicillin freely, even to wounded captives. Our own wounded often die for lack of sulfa. What kind of war is this, where our enemies are more humane than we are to our own men? The letter was passed up through the OSS and eventually into briefing folders at the highest levels of SHAEF. General Eisenhower himself read excerpts. He made a brief note. Medical strength is a force multiplier. Ensure frontline medical resupply remains priority. August 15th, 1944. In the recovery tent. Otto Weiss was now walking with a crutch, the wound on his leg healing well. His strength was returning faster than anyone expected. The American doctor had checked on him that morning and smiled. Looks like you're good enough to be transferred, he said. Rear POW camp, better beds, hot food. No more shell fire. Otto looked up from the chess game he'd been playing with a captured Panzer Grenadier across the aisle. Thank you, he said in halting English. The doctor shrugged. You're welcome. As he turned to leave, Otto called after him. May I ask one question? Sure. Why do you not hate us? We have done terrible things. The doctor paused. His face didn't betray emotion, just a tired understanding. We hate the war, he said softly. Not the wounded. The last thing Otto took with him was the band from his wrist. A small, smudged tag with his name, rank, blood type, and the treatment log, where in block letters it read, Penicillin administered. 3 units. He would keep it for the rest of his life, a reminder not just of survival, but of the day everything he believed had begun to unravel. September 1944. U.S. Psychological Warfare Division, POWs, London, HQ. Captain Roger Ellison tapped a pen against his teacup, watching as the projectionist switched slides. The room was filled with intelligence officers, linguists, and propagandists, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all studying the flickering black and white image on the screen. A German prisoner, bandaged, sitting on a cot, smiling. Beside him, a U.S. Army nurse handing him a cup of water. In the background, an open crate marked penicillin. "This," Ellison said, "is worth more than a division of tanks." He clicked to the next slide, a document, translated from German, intercepted from a surrendering officer. It was a diary entry. The Americans treat our wounded like their own. I was given penicillin. I wept not from pain, but from the shame that we would never have done the same. The room was silent. Gentlemen, Ellison continued, the war for the mind is underway, and the most powerful weapon we have is how we treat the men who came to kill us. Meanwhile, in U.S. field hospitals across Europe, the policy had become clear. Treat all wounded, regardless of nationality. The Geneva Conventions were not just a code, they were a stage. And every time a German soldier was given penicillin, it sent a ripple through the enemy's moral foundation. American medics weren't saints. They were exhausted, often overwhelmed, and many had watched comrades die in agony. But the use of penicillin became a symbol of something larger than survival. It was civilization in a syringe. Otto Weiss had now been transferred to a rear POW camp in England. The camp was surrounded by wire and watched by sentries, but inside, it was orderly, clean, structured. There was a library. There were scheduled meals. There were rules. And best of all, he was no longer in pain. He still limped, but the leg had healed. The infection was gone, and though he knew his fate was uncertain, he found something strange and alien stirring inside him. Gratitude. He kept to himself mostly, reading English-language newspapers with a dictionary by his side. He studied medical terminology. He stared for hours at the diagrams of the penicillin fermentation tanks and production charts in the Illustrated London News. One afternoon, an American lieutenant approached his bunk. "Feldwebel Weiss?" Otto looked up. "Yes." "You were in the St. Lo sector?" "I was. We have a report here from one of the doctors. Says you responded well to the treatment. No complications. That right?" "Yes. I owe your medics my life." The lieutenant gave a small nod, then paused. "We'd like you to write a statement. Just the facts. About what you experienced. It might be published for educational purposes." Otto hesitated. Then he said, "I will." A week later, the statement was published in an Allied pamphlet dropped by the thousands over German lines. "I was shot and captured by American forces. I expected humiliation. Instead, I was carried, treated, and given penicillin. They saved my leg, and likely my life. I now know their strength is not just in weapons, but in their humanity." Signed, Feldwebel Otto Weiss, formerly of the 91st Luftland Division. Back in Berlin, Joseph Goebbels seethed. The propaganda minister ordered immediate countermeasures. German radio denounced the stories as lies. Pamphlets were printed claiming American hospitals performed experiments on prisoners. Penicillin, they said, was a drug used to weaken the blood of true Germans. But the damage was already done. Whispers filtered through the ranks. German medics began to question orders. Prisoners returned home with stories not of torture, but of surgical wards, warm blankets, and miracle drugs flowing like water. In 1,000 subtle ways, the myth of Reich superiority was bleeding out. December 1944, near Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge. American medics, dug into frozen aid stations under shell fire, still reached for the same vials. Penicillin kept alive what bullets had tried to end, and every time it saved a man, whether American or German, it reminded those who witnessed it. This war was not just about land. It was about who would define the future of mercy. May 8, 1945. Flensburg, Germany. The war ends. Victory in Europe. The guns fell silent. The swastika was torn down across cities once ruled by fear and fire. In the north, in Flensburg, remnants of the Third Reich surrendered. Hitler was dead. The regime collapsed. Germany was in ruins. But for Feldwebel Otto Weiss, now prisoner number 44127 in Camp Ashchurch, Gloucestershire, there was no celebration. Just a quiet walk across the camp yard that morning, as other prisoners stood in stunned silence. The war was over. The guilt was not. He had read the headlines, the news of the camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. He saw the photos, rows of skeletal corpses, the ovens, the faces of horror carved into the skin of survivors. He sat down on the bench outside the infirmary, clutching the same wristband that had once been tied to his infected arm, the one that bore the word penicillin. and for the first time in his life, he wept freely. That same month in Washington, D.C., the War Department released its final medical statistics. Of the nearly 100,000 wounded U.S. troops treated with penicillin during the war, the survival rate from infected wounds had improved by more than 80% compared to World War I-era injuries. But hidden in the appendices was another detail. Over 5,000 Axis prisoners were also treated with penicillin in U.S. field hospitals. Mortality among treated POWs dropped by over 60%. It wasn't published for public attention. It was a matter of record, of principle. For the doctors, it had never been about sides. August 1940, Camp Ashchurch. The interview. Otto sat across from a British officer and 2 American officials from the newly formed Office of Strategic Services. They were compiling oral histories and psychological profiles, trying to understand how Nazi ideology had gripped so many so tightly. "I was not SS," Otto said, "but I believed in the Reich, in our mission." The British officer raised a brow. "And now?" Otto stared out the small window at the summer rain. "I saw your medics risk their lives for strangers," he said. "I watched them carry a wounded SS officer through gunfire just to save him. I was treated better as a prisoner than some of our own men were treated as heroes." He looked back at them. "I saw what it meant to be civilized. It wasn't what we were taught." October 1945. Release. Otto Weiss was repatriated to a devastated Germany. He returned to Hanover, where nothing of his childhood home remained. He found work in a provisional clinic set up by British occupation forces, cleaning floors at first, then assisting with sanitation, and eventually, as he learned English and restudied anatomy, he became a medical aide. It wasn't much, but it was something. In 1948, he applied for emigration to the United States under the Displaced Persons Act. Attached to his application was a recommendation letter from a U.S. Army surgeon. "This man was a former enemy. He left our care changed. He witnessed the power of medicine unshackled by hatred. He deserves a second life." 1951. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Otto Weiss became Otto White. He took up work at a pharmaceutical warehouse. Later, he joined a team studying antibiotic distribution in low-income clinics. He never forgot what he had seen in that canvas hospital near St. Lo. He spoke rarely of the war, but when asked why he had chosen this life, he would reach into his coat pocket and pull out a yellowed piece of cloth with faded red writing. "Penicillin administered, 3 units. That," he would say quietly, "was the first time I saw what mercy really looked like." Legacy penicillin did more than save lives on the battlefield. It altered minds. It eroded dogma. It was, in the end, not just a miracle drug, but a symbol of what a more just world might look like, even amidst the greatest violence mankind had ever known. It was hope in a glass vial. And for many, like Otto Weiss, it was the beginning of a long and painful journey back to humanity.